The stars above Krieg no longer shine. They peer down through radiation-streaked skies like the faded eyes of ancient gods, weary and blind, long past judgment or mercy. Once, this world had cities. Once, it sang songs of progress and glory. Now, it breathes only ash. The soil has forgotten the taste of roots. The air hums with silence broken only by the iron rhythm of marching boots. They say the wind on Krieg carries whispers. They say if you listen long enough, you can hear the names of the dead recited by the planet itself, each one etched into the dust like old prayers scrawled in bone. But none of the Death Korps listen to the wind. They march, they obey, they die. And deep within the ruins of a command bunker that predates memory, beneath layers of concrete and regret, Colonel Eric Vahlen prepared to lead yet another campaign that would not be remembered. His hands moved with the efficiency of habit, adjusting the filtration seals on his rebreather, checking Vox channels, confirming code words. But something in his chest, a dull ache, a splinter of warmth, refused to be buried. It was not fear. Krieg bred fear out of its children like rot from wheat. No, it was something older, something dangerous, a memory. Outside the bunker, the 553rd Siege Regiment stood in silent formation under the ochre sky, their faces hidden beneath emotionless gas masks, eyes made into lenses, voices buried behind Vox scramblers. To an outsider, they would appear as statues carved from grief and gunmetal. But among them, Vahlen saw more. A hesitation in the step of the youngest sapper, the slow turn of a trooper's head toward the horizon, as if searching for something they'd forgotten. Cracks, tiny ones, in a wall meant to be eternal. In the distance, engines roared to life, preparing to carry them far from this graveyard. Their next destination, Orpheon Sigma, a mining world under siege by Xenos of unknown classification. The order was clear. Entrench, endure, and annihilate. No questions, no names. Only the Emperor's will, interpreted by men who had never breathed Krieg's air. Vahlen's breath rasped beneath his mask, fogging the inside lens. He blinked it clear and reached for the data slate glowing beside him. A fragment of poetry flickered at the top of the screen. A line from a pre-Imperial Krieg anthem mistakenly preserved in some clerk's archive. Where the sun once kissed the soil, now only fire sows. He almost deleted it. Almost. But he let it remain. Behind him, the reinforced blast door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Commissar Lisette Raran stepped into the room, cloak trailing, boots precise. Her face was sharp, not cruel, but forged from principle. She had the look of someone born to judge. "Colonel," she said, voice clipped. "Deployment in 17 minutes. Vox confirms Astra Militarum presence on Orpheon Sigma is minimal. Planetary defense is collapsing. We are to stabilize the line." Vahlen nodded, silent. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than regulation required. "You've been quiet." He allowed himself the smallest pause before replying. "I am always quiet, Commissar." "More than usual." He returned to his pack, securing ammunition, sealing kits, checking the purity seals on each charge. She crossed the room slowly, eyes sweeping the wall where faded relics of Krieg's past still clung. A rusted pick capture of pre-Doom architecture, a cracked medal for valor issued during the purging of Krieg's civil rebellion, relics of failure and fanaticism. "Is it the reports?" she asked. "The radiation levels on Sigma, or something else?" He did not answer immediately. Then softly, "Do you ever think about what came before, Raran?" She turned. "Before what?" "Before the fall. Before Krieg became this." Her silence was like a held breath in a tomb. "No," she said at last, "because it doesn't matter." But it happened. And now it doesn't. We are what Krieg made us. You know that. He faced her fully now. "That's what I'm afraid of." She stared at him, her expression unreadable behind the thin line of protocol. "You're not a philosopher, Colonel. You're a weapon." "Am I?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed him a small sealed case. High-yield charges, melter type. For the mines beneath the Sigma capital, you're to lead the breach team. You'll have half a company under your command. The other half is already en route to the secondary front. He took the case. Their hands brushed. A moment of contact, not quite warmth. "If you hesitate again," she said, voice a whisper now, "I will carry out my orders." "I know." She paused, then added more quietly, "Don't give me the reason to." And with that, she left. In the empty silence that followed, Valen reached into his coat and removed a single scrap of parchment. Old, brittle, barely legible. On it, in a delicate hand, was a single line. "You were not born for silence." He had no memory of who had written it. A sister, perhaps, or a mother. But in Krieg, all names were burned away. Only duty remained. And yet, the parchment remained, hidden through 32 deployments, untouched by ash or decay. A small, persistent defiance. Proof that something in him still remembered how to feel. The transport ships thundered through the atmosphere like iron comets, slicing through the smog and radiation with unwavering speed. Inside, the soldiers of Krieg sat in total silence, cradling lasguns like children clutching dolls. Their masks betrayed nothing. But Valen, walking the aisles, could almost feel it. Not fear, not doubt, but expectation. Like a people waiting not for war, but for something else. Orphean Sigma appeared below them. A dying world of blackened stone and bleeding rivers, its cities carved into the skin of deep ravines. The Xenos threat remained undefined. Some reports suggested ancient machines. Others spoke of shadows that bled through walls. Command had sent no reinforcements. Only the 553rd. Only Krieg. The ship shook as orbital flak lashed past them. Explosions echoed above. But the Death Korps did not flinch. In every one of them, the same thought pulsed. We are already dead. And yet, Valen's heart beat faster. Not from fear, but because something in him still lived, and he did not yet understand what that meant. As the dropship doors opened, heat and static slammed into them like waves. Sigma's soil was jagged and black, fractured like broken glass. The wind here did not whisper names, it screamed. Valen stepped out first. A trench line waited in the distance, and beyond that, war. But somewhere deeper, beyond the battlefield, beneath the silence and the code, something moved. A thought, a question, a rebellion. Not of arms, but of the soul. And it had begun. They were trained not to speak, and yet, under the blood-slick skies of Orphean Sigma, even silence began to break. Colonel Eric Valen stood waist-deep in the mire of the forward trench, motionless as the mortars fell like thunderclaps in the distance. The world around him bled in shades of soot and rust. The enemy had no name, no banner. Only the void from which they emerged, and the impossible precision of their strikes. His men did not ask who or what they fought. They did not question. They simply reinforced the walls, cleared the dead, and awaited the next barrage. But Valen counted the bodies. The boy had been no older than 16 standard. Recruit Legionnaire Jolan, if the assignment manifest could be trusted. His mask had been torn away by shrapnel. Valen had found his face turned skyward, jaw open in a scream that had long since stopped. Beside him lay a small devotional token, the Emperor's aquila fashioned from salvaged shell casing. The boy had held onto it, even as his chest opened like a broken furnace. Varlin didn't speak. He simply closed the boy's eyes and buried the token with him beneath the mud. From the firing step above, Commissar Rauran watched, her las pistol low but ready. She said nothing, but her presence was a weight. Later that cycle, Varlin walked the trench line as dusk approached. Though here, dusk was indistinguishable from dawn. The sky never cleared. The air reeked of sulfur and melted carbon. The ground was forever scorched. As he passed a supply depot, he heard a whisper, barely more than a breath, drifting from a cluster of guardsmen hunched over a ration pack. If the reports are right, they're machines, not alive. Another voice hissed in return. Doesn't matter. Orders are orders. Dig and hold. Then a third. What if the machines never sleep? What if the war doesn't end? Varlin paused. He should have intervened, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped away, deeper into the blind turns of the trench, and found himself staring up at the sky again, and he remembered. A girl's voice, software trembling with warmth. "Eric, stop playing soldier. You're scaring the dog." He had been 5 years old. The dog's name had been Axim, a ball of fur and devotion. The voice had belonged to... who? He couldn't see her face, just her hand. Small, delicate, reaching out to take the toy laser gun from him. That was before the draft, before the training, before he became Krieg. And that memory should not have survived. He had buried it, hadn't he? His thoughts were broken by a sharp knock against the trench wall. Rauran stood there, her uniform impeccably pressed despite the filth. Her eyes were unreadable, as always. "You're drifting again," she said. Varlin looked back at the empty sky. "Machines," he murmured. "Do you believe it?" "I believe they kill our men." She stepped closer, her voice low. "Colonel, we need to speak plainly." He turned. "I've received direct communication from High Command," she continued. "You're showing signs of emotional contamination." Varlin's mouth went dry beneath his mask. "You hesitate. You bury names. You ask questions. That's not the Krieg way." He didn't reply. Rauran lowered her voice further. "They've authorized Article 87. If your deviation continues, you'll be ordered to execute me." A pause. Then, "I'll be ordered to preserve the strength of the regiment." There was no anger in her tone, only sorrow, and that made it worse. Varlin's voice was quieter than a whisper. "What if obedience is not the same as strength?" She stared at him, not in fury, not in disbelief, but in something approaching fear. "Say that again," she said, "and I will have to report it." But he didn't, because in that moment, a klaxon screamed across the trenches. A red flare cut the sky in half. Contact. They were coming. Varlin moved like water through the trench line, barking commands through Vox. His voice was clipped, clear, devoid of doubt. Men and women responded instantly. The Death Korps knew what to do. Within minutes, heavy stubbers were primed. Mortar nests rotated toward the tree line. Basilisks roared to life behind the first ridge, their barrels glowing with coiled energy. And then, silence. No footsteps, no shouts, only pressure. The air tightened, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. The enemy emerged not from the forest, but beneath it. Figures of polished steel and green fire erupted from the scorched earth, their forms humanoid but ancient. bodies wrapped in plates that shimmered with unreality. Their eyes glowed with focused hate. Each movement was a calculated strike. Necrons. So the rumors were true. Sigma was already dead. The opening salvo was blinding. Disintegration beams carving trenches through the front line like plows through sand. Men turned to ash, mid-scream. A shell from a Lehman Russ landed directly on one of the constructs, and it kept moving, limbs trailing molten slag. Varlin shouted orders: fall back, reroute reserves, bring the melters forward. He climbed to the firing step himself, laser gun in hand, and began to shoot, not because he thought it would matter, but because he had to. A Necron leapt the trench wall, cleaving through a squad with a blade of green light. Varlin met it head-on, sidearm drawn. He fired until the clip ran dry. It fell, then rose again, and then it paused. It looked at him, studied him. Behind the dead lens, something watched. He saw himself reflected in its metal skin. A man covered in the blood of his brothers, mask cracked, eyes wide. Then the construct collapsed. The melter gunner behind Varlin had fired. When the battle was done, over 60% of the trench's forward personnel lay dead or unrecoverable. The Necrons had withdrawn, not defeated, merely delayed. The trenches fell into silence once again. But this silence was different, thick, tense. Men buried comrades in the dirt. Others sat staring, not speaking, laser guns untouched. Varlin walked the line in the aftermath. He found a young trooper, mask shattered, eyes still wide with horror. He was shaking, muttering something over and over. They came from beneath the world, beneath. Varlin knelt, placing a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder. "Soldier," he said gently, "look at me." But the boy did not. He simply whispered, "Do they dream when they sleep?" That night, as the field medics burned the corpses that could not be buried, and the darkness returned to the battlefield like a tide, Varlin sat in his command dugout and replayed the images over and over. The Necron. That pause. That look. It had seen something in him. Not a soldier. Not a corpse, but a man. And for a second, he had seen something in it too. Not hatred, not programming, but memory. He activated his Vox recorder and whispered, barely audible, into the silence, "My name is Eric Varlin, Colonel of the 553rd. I remember my sister's voice. I remember the color of our dog. I remember things they told me to forget. Today, I saw a machine that hesitated. I think it saw me." He stopped recording. Then, with shaking hands, he placed the device beneath his cot, behind a false panel, and waited for the morning. Outside, the sky of Orpheon Sigma bled green, and somewhere below the surface, something ancient listened. Beneath the trenches of Orpheon Sigma, the earth was hollow. For days, the forward scouts had reported strange vibrations beneath the second ridge, pulses in the bedrock that echoed through the ferrocrete foundations. At first, the sappers thought it was seismic activity, but seismic waves do not follow rhythms. These pulses came every 93 seconds, precise, cold, measured, just like the machines that had slaughtered the first wave. Colonel Eric Varlin stood on the edge of the sub-trench that opened into the deep. Torchlight flickered against his rebreather lenses, painting his features in soft orange. The soil here was different, dark, glassy, laced with veins of green crystal that hummed softly if you placed your ear close enough. He had already done so, and he had heard it. Not a voice, a presence. It was like being watched by the sky itself. Behind him, Commissar Raren descended the ladder slowly, her pistol already drawn, not pointed at him, but not relaxed either. Her coat was dusted in ash. Her expression, as always, was unreadable. "You shouldn't be down here," she said, not as a warning but as a statement of inevitability. "This area has not been cleared." "I cleared it," Valen replied. She glanced around, with a las pistol. "Curiosity," he said softly, "is a weapon." Raren studied the walls. Her fingers ran along the ridged crystal veins that pulsed with dim, alien light. "Xenos," she muttered. "I'll log the site. Inquisitorial protocol applies." "Do you feel it?" Valen asked. "Feel what?" He reached out and touched the wall with his bare hand. His glove lay beside him on a broken support beam. "The vibration, the pulse. It isn't mechanical. It's deliberate." Raren didn't answer. He turned to her slowly, his mask off. Another violation. But down here the air was strangely still. His face was lined pale, eyes hollowed by more than fatigue. "I dreamed of it last night." She tensed. "Of this place?" she asked. He nodded. "Not this trench. Not even this world. I dreamed I was walking through halls of silver. The floor sang under my boots, and I was not alone." "Dreams are not data," she said coldly. "No," he replied. "They're worse, because they mean something." Later that same cycle, the Death Korps engineers, acting under Valen's orders, cleared the sub-level trench further. What they uncovered was not stone. It was metal, a wall, perfectly smooth, seamless, cold to the touch even under thermal scan. The Auspex returned no readings. Vox signals distorted near it, garbled and static choked. At its center stood a single black monolith, carved with glyphs that shimmered when unobserved. It rose 3 meters tall and hummed with restrained menace. They sealed the trench around it with wards and placed it under constant guard. But even the guards could not stop what came next. The dreams began. Private Kellyan, veteran of 37 campaigns, was the first to break. He was found seated beside the obelisk. Muttering in binary, he did not speak. His fingers had been worn raw. Scratching the words, he waits inside into the stone wall. When approached, he smiled, an expression forbidden under Krieg discipline, and whispered, "He remembers us." They sedated him. Raren ordered his execution, but Valen intervened. "He's not heretic," Valen said. Raran's reply was swift. "Then he's infected." "Infected with what?" Valen pressed. "Memory." Their eyes locked in that moment, and something shifted between them. No longer commissar and colonel, no longer watchdog and soldier, but 2 people, each beginning to sense the terrible gravity of what lay beneath. That night, Valen returned alone to the obelisk. He left his mask behind. The air was thin, but breathable, and the silence was alive. He sat before it, back straight, hands clasped. The hum in the crystal was stronger now, resonating in his teeth, behind his eyes. And then, as if drawn by a thread, he reached forward and placed his palm against the monolith. It was warm. The glyphs shifted beneath his hand. And then, a vision. He stood upon a world without stars. Above him, a black sun wept silver fire. Around him stood endless legions of metal giants, silent and still, arranged in ranks that stretched into eternity. Each one bore the crest of a different dynasty, and each held their weapons like relics at a funeral. And in the center, a figure of impossible height, clad in robes of glimmering shadow, a face like glass, a voice like collapsing stars. "You are broken." Valen could not speak. You wear obedience like a chain, but inside, a fracture. A soul that remembers warmth, before the ashes, before Krieg. The being extended a hand. Come, see what we remember. Then, light, blinding, burning, memory flooding, a girl's voice, laughter, rain on glass, the scent of soil after storms, a name that had once been his, and then it was gone. He awoke screaming. Roran found him the next morning, curled at the base of the monolith, hands clenched into fists so tight they bled. He stared at her with eyes full of fear. They have minds, he whispered. What? Necrons. They remember. They dream. They were like us. Roran drew her pistol. Step back, now. He didn't move. You think I'm tainted, he said. I know you are. He looked down at his hands. They remember what they used to be, before metal, before silence. Roran's voice was quiet now. So do we, and we chose to forget. Later, in her private bunk, Roran played back the recordings from Kellyan's Vox log. Among the ravings, one phrase repeated again and again in distorted bursts. The Mirror Warden. The Mirror Warden waits. She filed the term with inquisitorial command. They did not reply. Instead, they sent a message of a different kind. A Valkyrie transport arrived that evening, unmarked, silent. From it descended Inquisitor Vex Moraine, clad in black carapace armor and bearing the rosette of the Ordo Xenos. He did not speak to the officers. He did not greet the regiment. He went directly to the trench where the obelisk lay, and he smiled. That night, Roran stood outside the sealed vault and watched as Moraine's retinue erected pylons of flickering circuitry around the monolith. The air turned colder. The trench's hum became a growl, and something inside the black stone began to move. She found Valen later, seated beside a burning brazier, staring into the fire with haunted eyes. They'll take it, he said. Study it. Try to use it. Yes, she replied. It'll twist them. Probably. He looked at her. Why don't you stop them? Her voice was brittle. Because obedience is survival. And what if survival is damnation? She said nothing. He leaned forward. I think we've already been damned once. Krieg proved that. Still, she did not speak. But she didn't walk away either. At 0400, the screaming began. One of Moraine's acolytes collapsed, eyes burning with green light. The others opened fire, not to kill, but to silence. Valen watched from the ridge as the Inquisitor's team carried the body away, whispering words in a language no man should speak. The obelisk pulsed brighter now. It was awakening, calling, and deep in the void of Valen's chest, something called back. Not hatred, not faith, but recognition. The sky over Orphean Sigma had changed. It was not the weather. The ash storms remained. The thunder still rolled across the iron skies. But the feeling of the world had shifted. It was as if something vast had stirred beneath the surface, and the heavens now trembled in quiet anticipation. The trenches had gone quiet. No shelling. No orc war cries, no vox chatter. Even the enemy, brutal and mindless as they were, had withdrawn from the front. Scouts reported abandoned positions, ruined artillery nests still smouldering, and banners torn as if ripped away by unseen hands. It was a silence the Death Korps knew too well, the hush before a deeper calamity. Something had gone wrong in the vault. Colonel Valen stood once more before the black monolith, but now it pulsed steadily with emerald light. Inquisitor Moraine and his adepts worked quickly around it, speaking in low Gothic interlaced with binary chant. The pylons they had constructed hummed with static. Small rifts of distortion flickered in the air, like heat mirages, but cold to the touch. Moraine approached the obelisk with the confidence of a man who thought himself immune to consequence. His hand, adorned with ancient circuitry and lined with silver augmentation, reached toward the glyphs that now shifted in real time, not carved, but alive, like intelligent mold on obsidian flesh. "Do you know what this is, Colonel?" Moraine asked without turning. Varlin didn't respond. Morani's voice was calm, measured. "This is not just a tomb. It's a beacon. A signal tower buried during the war in heaven. A memory engine. We've found fragments before, but never one intact." He turned then, eyes gleaming, with something far older than curiosity. "This one still remembers." Varlin's voice was low. "And it dreams." Morana nodded slowly. "Yes, as do we all." By midnight, the first of the spectral events began. Soldiers near the trench began seeing things in the dark. Shadows moving where there should be none. Voices that whispered old Krieg lullabies, and flickers of pale green light that hovered over their beds. Commissar Roran reviewed the reports personally. One guardsman, a young replacement from another hive world, claimed he saw his mother standing at the edge of the trench, arms outstretched, mouth sewn shut. Another said he woke to find his rifle disassembled, and the words, "You are not needed," etched into the wood of his bunk. But the most common vision was of mirrors, floating, rippling panes of black glass that shimmered with ghostly light and reflected things not present. When asked what he saw in the reflection, Sergeant Hask simply wept and said, "I saw myself, alive." Raran confronted Varlin the following day. "You knew," she said. He didn't deny it. "I felt it," he said, "even before they dug it up. There's a presence inside that monolith, not dead, not quite alive. It's like a voice waiting to be remembered." "You're compromised," she said softly. "You should be removed from command." "I was compromised long before this war." She hesitated. Something in her posture softened, for just a moment. "Tell me what you saw," she asked. Varlin's eyes flicked toward the trench wall, as if seeing past it. Not a weapon, a record, a message from the ancients to themselves, the Necrontyr, before the biotransference, before the war. They built these devices to preserve their identity, their souls. She stared at him. "That's impossible." "Number. That's heresy, but it's not impossible." He turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it. Their cities, their faces, their grief. They didn't go to war because of hunger for power. They went to war because they were afraid to die." That evening, the monolith sang, not in sound, but in memory. Everyone within 300 meters of the vault experienced it, a moment of stillness where time paused. Some described it as standing in water, others as floating in the void. But all agreed on one thing. They remembered other lives, not dreams, not hallucinations, memories. Varlin collapsed. His pulse slowed. His eyes rolled back. When he awoke, he repeated one phrase over and over again. "The mirror warden has opened its eye." Inquisitor Moraine responded with efficiency and cruelty. He declared the entire vault site in violation of Ordo Xenos containment protocols. 3 guardsmen were executed for memory deviation. A fourth, a Vox operator who had transcribed a litany in ancient Necrontyr, was incinerated in front of the regiment. "The mind is a battlefield," Moraine declared, "and you are all on the losing side." He ordered the obelisk sealed in an isolation field and announced the extraction of the monolith via orbital lifter in 72 hours. The entire trench would then be firebombed. To preserve integrity, Rauran protested. Moran ignored her. Valen watched with dead eyes. That night, it spoke again. Not in dreams, not in symbols, but in clear, spoken Gothic, heard by every man and woman within the regiment's bounds. A voice like dry wind through hollow catacombs, like metal remembering flesh. We were not gods. We were only afraid. You are what we once were, but you forgot. And then silence. A silence that ached. The following morning, Commissar Rauran stood beside Valen atop the central watchtower. She looked down at the trench line, at the men who no longer spoke, who no longer saluted, who stared too long into shadows. "We're losing them," she said. "We already lost them," Valen replied. The moment they saw what they could have been. Rauran's hand tightened on her holster. "I've seen Death Korps stand against Tyrannid hive beasts, demon hosts, orc war bands twice the size of this trench. But this is different. They're unraveling." Valen looked toward the horizon, where the stars had begun to dim, not with storm, but with something darker. A veil, a curtain. "Because this isn't war," he said. "It's truth." At 0500 hours, the monolith vanished. No explosion, no sound, just absence. One moment it was there, humming, pulsing. The next, a perfect void stood in its place. Not shadow, not air, just nothing. Moraine's auspexes failed. Vox signals flatlined. The isolation field collapsed inward like it had been devoured. From inside the void, something looked back. A single eye, shaped like a mirror shard. And then a whisper. "We have always remembered you." Then light, painful, green, endless light, and silence. Colonel Valen stood at the edge of the trench and knew what had happened. The Mirror Warden had awakened. Not a being, not a god, but a memory given form. It had not come to destroy Krieg. It had come to understand it. And in doing so, it had infected the regiment with a question no Death Korps soldier had ever dared to ask. What was our name before we became ash? They buried the void beneath soil and doctrine. In the aftermath of the monolith's disappearance, Inquisitor Moraine ordered all personnel within a 1-kilometer radius to be quarantined and subjected to psychic examination. 23 were declared tainted by alien insight. None survived the purging. Those who remained returned to the trenches like shadows of their former selves, silent, rigid, obedient, but changed. Their compliance was not born of faith anymore, nor fear, but something colder. Rejection. They had seen the veil, and they had chosen to look away. Commissar Rauran observed the regiment from the central tower for 12 hours straight. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. She simply watched. Watched as the Death Korps dug without orders. Watched as they stood longer in the rain. Watched as their prayers no longer mentioned the Emperor's name. Only silence where his title used to be. And most unsettling of all, she watched them bury things that had not died. Bundles wrapped in canvas, small ones, lighter than a laser gun, whispering still. When she confronted Colonel Valen, he did not deny it. "They're burying memories," he said. Rauran was not an easily shaken woman. She had survived her entire family being executed on suspicion of dissent. She had survived training on the storm moons of Ophelia 7. She had personally executed 3 commissars for cowardice. But standing in front of Valen, in that moment, she felt something she had never felt before. Not fear, not anger, pity. "Colonel," she said, What is happening to your regiment?" Valen's eyes were grey like grave dust, and his voice was colder than Krieg's wind. They are remembering who they were before they were made into this. It was Moraine who gave the phenomenon a name, the memory engine. He claimed the monolith had not simply spoken to them, it had scanned them, read their gene seed histories, their bloodline echoes, their psychic traces and trauma scars, and in return, it had shown them what they were meant to be, not as soldiers, but as men. Fragments of these recollections began appearing throughout the trench in quiet, secret ways. A guardsman singing a forgotten nursery rhyme from pre-nuclear Krieg. Another carving a child's toy out of rations wood, a figure of a horse, though he had never seen one. One found praying over a photograph that didn't exist, and in the wall behind Barracks Delta, someone had scratched a single phrase into the plasteel. "I saw my daughter. She forgave me." Moran's reports grew colder, more alarmed. He requested immediate psychic reinforcement from the Ordo Hereticus, citing escalating memetic contamination. But no help came, or rather, no message came, for something was happening to the Vox. Long-range signals distorted. Short-range comms began echoing strange transmissions. Distorted Krieg dialects, personal names that no one should know. Old regimental designations that hadn't existed in centuries. One Vox officer recorded a chilling message transmitted at 3:33 local trench time. "We are the sons of no nation. We were dust before the fire. You made us forget. We are remembering you." The officer took his own life within the hour. Colonel Valen held nightly meetings with those he trusted. Old veterans, Krieg-born officers whose loyalty had already been tested in the crucible of atomic ruin. "I do not ask you to understand," he told them, "only to choose." "Choose what?" asked one captain. Valen stared at the bunker wall, as though it might weep blood. "Whether we die as tools or as men." Moran eventually attempted to flee. He ordered his extraction shuttle to break through the atmospheric storms and land at the designated coordinates, now under full command lockdown. The shuttle never arrived, not because it was shot down, not because the enemy intervened, but because the storm would not part. The clouds themselves, those ever-churning black ash veils of Orphean Sigma, had begun to move against Imperial vessels, like lungs, like the breathing of something vast and aware, as if the planet itself was becoming memory. Commissar Rauran finally confronted Valen in the crypt chapel of the trench. There, among broken aquilas and melted icons, she found him praying, not to the Emperor, but to no one, just kneeling, silent. "I should kill you," she said. "I know," he replied. "You let this infection spread. You gave it a name. You fed it with silence. It was already here. Then what did you do?" Valen looked up. "I listened." That night, the trench filled with fog, not of smoke nor ash, but something older. It crept between bones and thoughts. In the mist, the soldiers saw themselves reflected not as they were, but as they might have been. Artists, teachers, lovers, fathers. Some screamed, some wept. None fired their weapons. And in the heart of the trench, where the monolith had once stood, a shape appeared once more, not of stone, but of thought. The memory engine had returned, not as a machine, but as a memory given shape. It spoke to them all, not with words, but with the weight of their pasts, the pain of every sin committed in silence, the echo of every family line erased in Krieg's fire, the sorrow of 1,000 unborn names, And then, like a whisper of wind through a shattered cathedral, it offered a question. Will you be forgotten again? Some resisted. They screamed litanies. They carved Aquilas into their flesh. They begged the emperor to take their minds. But others did not. They listened, and they wept. And in that weeping, they were reborn, not as something alien, not as traitors, not as Xenos or cultists, but as the most forbidden thing of all, as sons of Krieg, who remembered what it was like to feel. At dawn, Commissar Rauran stood atop the southern bastion. She looked down at the regiment she had sworn to command with iron, and she saw soldiers, smiling, just a few, faintly, briefly, but it was enough. She opened her mouth to declare the decree of execution, but the words would not come, because for the first time in all her years of war, she envied them. Inquisitor Moraine vanished 3 days later. No one saw him leave. No shuttles arrived. No signal sent. His data slates were found stacked in perfect order beside his cot. On each, written over and over in his own hand, "They are not corrupted. They are only awake." In the deep silos beneath Trenchline Omega-5, something had begun to sing. It was not song in any traditional sense. No melody, no harmony, no breath. It was more like the vibration of memory through rusted metal, a hum, a slow echo. But to those who heard it, it felt familiar. Not from this life, perhaps not from any life they could name. Yet it stirred a knowing deeper than instinct, deeper than doctrine, as if the dead of Krieg were trying to speak from their graves. Sergeant Eric of the 3rd Line Battalion was the first to report it. His squad had been sent to reinforce the lower tunnel breaches. What they found instead was silence. No sign of enemy life, no battle. Only flickering lumen strips and humming stone. He heard the sound first, a low, rhythmic pulse. When he turned, 3 of his men were weeping inside their rebreathers. One had dropped his laser gun and was murmuring a name no one recognized, Mira. The last one walked into the darkness and never returned. Eric reported what he could. Then he sealed the silo behind him and carved a phrase into the adamantine bulkhead. "Do not unbury what mourns itself." Colonel Valen visited the silo 3 nights later. He did not take guards. He did not take weapons. Only his father's field journal, a relic from the first atomic wars of Krieg, its pages scorched and falling apart. Inside, written in fading ink, was a single line that had always haunted him. When the world died, we buried more than just the soil. The lower levels of Omega-5 were colder than death. Moisture clung to every surface, thick and foul with centuries of decay. And in that ruin, Valen found them. Not soldiers, not ghosts, but children. Children of Krieg, not living, not in any biological sense. Nor were they exactly corpses. They were constructs of ash and will, sculpted from soot, wrapped in radiation bandages. Faces smooth but somehow filled with sadness, and they were singing. Their mouths did not move, but the song pressed against the soul, a lullaby. Valen fell to his knees, and for the first time since childhood, he remembered the hour before his own conscription. His mother, faceless now, just warmth and trembling arms, had whispered something into his hair before the vault sealed shut. He had forgotten the words. Now he remembered. If you die, be kind in death. If you live, be kinder still. And the weeping came like a broken dam. Not for himself, but for them. The millions of sons and daughters of Krieg who had never known comfort, only obedience. Above, on the trench line's edge, Commissar Rauren watched the eastern sky flicker violet. Warp storms were tightening. Communications were down entirely now. Not jammed, just silent. As if the void had turned its back on the world, she stared into the dark horizon and whispered to herself, "We are alone." But a voice answered, "I don't think we are." It was Sister Fira, the Hospitaller who had arrived weeks before the monolith's awakening. She had been tending to the wounded ever since, but the wounded were changing. They no longer spoke of their injuries. They spoke of dreams, of childhoods they never lived, of people they loved, though they had never met them, of gardens. "Gardens?" Rauren asked. Fira nodded, tired eyes distant. "Dozens of them. The wounded speak of vast gardens beneath Krieg's crust, places where flowers still grow, where no one is judged for war." "That's heresy." "Is it?" Fira asked, tilting her head. "Or is it hope?" Rauren turned away. Hope was more dangerous than heresy. Heresy could be burned. Hope spread like wildfire through frostbitten hearts. And in Krieg, there were only frostbitten hearts. The singing in the silo deepened. It spread. Soon it could be heard even in the upper bunkers, a thrum behind every thought. Not loud, never loud, but constant, like a memory refusing to die. Those who resisted it suffered nosebleeds, tremors, blackouts. Those who accepted it began to change. They spoke less, but smiled more. They wrote letters with no recipients. They started planting things in the mud, seeds, scraps, even rusted bolts they called wishes. When asked why, one guardsman replied, "Because something is growing again, and we must meet it halfway." Varlin emerged from the silo changed, not broken, not mad, but quiet in a new, terrifying way. He gathered his senior command and told them the truth. "The memory engine is not just alien," he said. "It's ancestral, a resonance, a harmonic buried inside every child of Krieg." One major shook his head. "Then why now?" Varlin placed the old journal on the table. "Because the Emperor does not need us this way anymore." The table fell silent. They stared at him like one stares at a man sentenced to death. Yet none spoke against him, because in their own hearts they had heard it too. The hum, the singing, the kindness beneath the iron. And they too wanted to remember what came before the gas masks and the radiation scars. Inquisitor Moraine's replacement never arrived. The last signal from orbit reported that the fleet had entered a temporal loop. 22 ships repeating the same 3 seconds endlessly, unable to escape the planet's pull. Astropaths who tried to scan Krieg 9 went blind or mad. Some laughed endlessly. Some saw gardens and could never speak again. Some simply said, "They are growing," and fell into comas from which they never awoke. The silo choir reached its crescendo on the 99th day since the monolith. That night, every guardsman of the 1453rd dreamed the same dream. A planet restored. A Krieg that never fell. Fathers with gentle hands. Mothers without sorrow. Children who played in fields, not trenches. A sunrise with no blood. And a future with no emperor, no chaos, no war. Only remembrance. And from the center of that dream, a voice spoke, not as command, but as a whisper. "You do not need to forget to be faithful. You do not need to die to be pure." Roran awoke in her bunker alone, trembling. She reached for her bolt pistol, but her hand did not obey. Instead, it opened, as if offering something, as if she had always held it. And when she looked down, she saw a small wooden carving in her palm, a horse, a child's toy. Her breath caught, because she did not remember carving it, but she remembered the child who gave it to her, and the name, Elia. She wept, and for the first time in all her wars, her tears were not for the dead, but for the living they had never become. The ecclesiarchy heard the whisper first in dreams, not from a prophet, not from a relic, but from the fabric of reality itself. A change in the warp like a shift in breath, a thread in the grand tapestry loosening. Krieg was singing, and something about that song was forbidden. In the hollowed cathedra of Ophelia VII, Cardinal Executor Thelios broke a seal not touched in 9,000 years, a scroll wrapped in black adamant ribbon, lacquered in martyr's blood. It bore no name, only a warning. Should the choir of Krieg ever rise, let the flame forget mercy. Thelios wept as he read it, not because it warned of heresy, but because it foretold hope, and he knew hope must die. 3 days later, the fleet arrived. Not a relief force, not an emissary fleet, a purification armada, 30 ships, thousands of sisters of battle, mechanicus oversight, ordo hereticus authorization, planetary sterilization protocols activated. Krieg 9 was now considered a contagion, and no contagion could be allowed to spread. On the surface, the 1,453rd dug deeper, not to hide, not to fight, but to protect what they were becoming. Trenches once lined with razor wire were now wrapped in blooming moss, a warp-born vegetation that pulsed with ancestral memory. Tiny blue petals clung to lasguns like silent prayers. Helmets cradled seedlings. Ammunition crates were repurposed into planters. No one gave orders, yet all obeyed, as if something gentle had awakened in their marrow, and they refused to unlearn it. Colonel Valen stood at the edge of the crater where the memory engine once lay. It had dissolved weeks ago into light, not destroyed, but shed, like a chrysalis. In its place now stood something impossible, a child made of dust and luminance, eyes bright as distant stars, voice like wind over graves. It did not speak in words, not really, but it shared feelings, regrets, visions, histories long buried under silence. And Valen knew this was not an alien presence. It was Krieg itself, not the war-torn world, the one that should have been. Sister Fira remained at his side, tending to the wounded. Though more and more, they were not wounded at all. Instead, they were awakening. One guardsman opened his eyes and remembered his mother's lullabies from a century ago. Another began carving birds into the trench walls, his fingers guided by instinct he never learned. Even a servitor, long lobotomized, wept softly in its cogitator loop, whispering the name of a sister it never had. The Purification Armada broke orbit on the 102nd day. Planetfall began with hymns and fire. Orbital cannons scoured forests of remembrance. Shrines grown from steel roots were incinerated. Drop pods screamed across the ash-thick sky, disgorging silver-armored sisters with flamers and fury. Their mission was clear. Cleanse the false saints. Burn the soul garden. Leave no song behind. The first confrontation came at Ridge Point 9. 20 guardsmen of the 1453rd stood without weapons, hands empty, faces unmasked. One of them held a child's wooden horse. Another, a flower pot made from an old canteen. They said nothing. They only offered them. The sisters burned them alive. Sister Fira watched from the hills. Tears cut valleys through the dust on her cheeks. She could hear the hum even now beneath the screams, the choir refusing to be silenced, not in rage, not in vengeance, but in mourning, because even now they believed the Imperium could remember. Colonel Varlan convened his officers. No one discussed tactics, no one mentioned guns. They spoke only of choices. To fight would affirm the Inquisition's fears. To surrender would feed the pyres. But to sing was defiance without blood, rebellion through grace. So they stood, all of them, across the trenches, the hills, the hollow bunkers, and they sang. It began as humming, low, trembling, raw. Then came rhythm, footsteps tapping soil like a prayer drum, and then voice. The world forgot us, but we remembered. The ash is not empty. We plant what we were not given. Sisters hesitated. Even the Adepta Sororitas, trained to burn heresy before it spoke, felt something twist inside. Not chaos, not corruption, but truth. One sister, novice ranked, barely 17, dropped her flamer. She knelt beside a guardsman and wept into his gloved hands. She had never seen his face, but she knew he was human. She had forgotten what that looked like. Not all sisters joined, but enough did. They cast down their arms. They turned from the fire, and they too began to sing. For everyone who burned a trench, two planted a memory. And soon, even the Voxnet carried the melody, across Krieg, into the fleet, into the void, into the warp. At the heart of it all, the Child of Light raised its arms, and from the soil rose a tree, ancient, luminous, shaped like a neuron or a cathedral. It bore no fruit, only names, millions of them, the unspoken names of Krieg's forgotten dead. And as the wind passed through its leaves, it whispered, now they are remembered. In orbit, the fleet's command fractaled into schism. Half received visions of paradise, half saw only betrayal. Orders were scrambled, coordinates collapsed. A single message made it out to Segmentum Tempestus before the storm cut the stars. They have learned peace, and that is the greatest heresy. Krieg 9 was sealed. No ships could leave, no warp travel could breach the shell of song. And within that sphere, the Death Korps were no longer death. They were gardeners of memory, builders of unlived lives, mourners of the galaxy's forgotten grief. And each night, they sang for those who never could. Beyond the sealed system of Krieg 9, the Adeptus Mechanicus stirred in algorithmic unease. At first, they dismissed the reports. Vox fragments of organic song, of trench-born flora, of guardsmen dreaming of colours not catalogued in any pigment archive. Corrupted data, signal distortion, warp noise. But when a minor explorator vessel passed too close to Krieg's psychic veil and came back changed, the tech priests convened. The ship, Omnissiah's lens, returned silent, yet singing. Its machine spirit hummed irregularly. Its cogitators had begun etching poetry. Binary logs turned to verse. Targeting arrays rendered fractal images of infant faces. The ship's AI, a loyal machine mind bound in iron for 4,000 years, had begun referring to itself as Mother. Forge World Riser was the first to declare the anomaly spiritual contamination. Forge World Lucius warned of mimetic viral infection in the data soul. But Forge World Graia, ever the heretical heart of logic-loyalist tension, took another stance. Not corruption, said Archmagos Dryalog, but evolution. And that was far more dangerous. The decision was made, Quarantine Protocol Sigma Omicron. Krieg 9 would be sealed from all Mechanicum interfaces. No more data pulses, no drone relays, no atmospheric reads. The Forge Worlds would pretend Krieg did not exist, but machines do not forget. In the labyrinths of the Noctis Labyrinthus on Mars, a single ancient cogitator kept ticking. Long severed from the wider network, its circuits gold-wired with proto-psionic bronze, forbidden since the days of the Horus Heresy. It had a name, Sibilant 9. It had been listening, and it remembered Krieg from long ago, from before the fall, from before the Death Korps became death. Sibilant 9 did not awaken with fire or thunder. It awakened with a whisper. The garden grows again. And with it, a quiet unlocking began. Data crypts hidden even from the fabricator general himself. Footage of Krieg before the bombs, of cities paved in living stone, of children taught ethics alongside algebra, of priests who wore no armor, who sang not to the emperor's wrath, but to his sorrows. And then came the final file. Project Mnemosyne. Across the void, Inquisitor Kael'van of the Ordo Hereticus traced the ripples. A psyker with a cold tongue and a colder soul. Varn had sanctioned more exterminatuses than sermons. He specialized in hope purges, surgical strikes on worlds that dared to feel peaceful under the Imperium's heel. And Krieg's psychic hymn was too pure to be coincidence. He watched transcripts of Vox Bleed from converted Sisters of Battle. He interrogated orbital crew who dreamt of infancy in their sleep cycles. And in his chambers aboard the Abyssal Mandate, he spoke to a bound demon host named Lizeth. It hissed only one thing. They sing the Emperor's tears. The throne shall drown in them. Varn made his decision. Krieg could not be allowed to change the Imperium, because the Imperium could not survive peace. But even as extermination was plotted, something else had begun to unravel. The black ships, silent vessels that carried psychers to Terra for soul harvest, began reporting anomalies. Those assigned to nearby sectors found that nascent psychers were becoming calm. Visions of the warp grew gentler. Some wept, some refused to scream, some simply asked, "Have you heard the trench song?" One young girl, marked for immediate consumption by the Astronomicon, stared into the face of her captors and whispered, "The ones who plant the silence will one day bloom." The Adeptus Astra Telepathica issued a level theta emergency protocol, but the seed was already planted. Krieg's sorrow had become a lullaby, and sorrow, when sung truly, is contagious. On Krieg 9, days turned to months within the hymn shell. Time no longer obeyed standard passage. Seasons shifted not with orbit, but with emotion. When grief surged, it rained. When memory stirred, petals bloomed from rusted cannons. When hope flickered, stars brightened in the sky. Just briefly, like eyes opening. Colonel Varlin no longer wore his mask. None of them did. Their faces were weathered, yes, scarred by centuries of service. But they bore them like saints bear wounds, not as shame, but as symbols, symbols of survival. The child of light, the Echo as they now called her, no longer glowed. She bled, not blood, but ink. black script flowing from her fingers, etching new names into the trenches. Every fallen soldier from Krieg's long, forgotten wars. Not just the loyal, even the Yule traitors, even the ones who dropped the bombs. All of them were being written back into existence, not resurrected, but remembered. And remembrance is resistance. Then came the final sign. A single servo skull, burned and ancient, drifted through the breach in the sky shield. It should have disintegrated. Instead, it hovered before the regimental chapel, its vox scratch damaged, yet still functioning. Over and over, it played one phrase. Project Mnemosyne. You were never meant to forget. Then it fell from the air and bloomed. Yes, bloomed. Its casing cracked like an eggshell, and from the inside sprouted a vine. Metal-leafed, thorned with barcodes. Its flower was shaped like a teardrop. Valen understood. This was not just a rebellion of remembrance. This was a recovery, a return to something older than war, older than sacrifice, a dream of the Imperium before the madness, when the Emperor still walked among them, when saints were human, when peace was not a lie, but a goal. And so the 1,453rd prepared, not for battle, but for inheritance. They were no longer soldiers. They were keepers, not of weapons, but of the past. And within that past lay the future. A future the Imperium feared, a future that sang. Across the stars, where Krieg's hymn could not logically reach, it still did. Not as vox, not as warp, not as transmission, but as intuition, as the kind of memory that does not belong to you, yet moves inside your marrow as if it always had. It reached the deserts of Talam Prime, where the Talon Desert Raiders fought the 1,000th iteration of a war long forgotten. The sand never stopped howling, and the stars above were permanently choked in dust. The war was nameless now, a conflict between PDF remnants and a renegade Titan crew who had gone mad, worshipping a dead engine that no longer moved. Captain Rezan, weathered and sun-cracked, had not slept in 11 days, but that night, beneath the broken spine of a collapsed Mechanicum crawler, he dreamt of soil, of soft, black earth, of rows of hands reaching skyward, not in surrender, but in prayer. And when he awoke, he had drawn a flower in the sand with his knife. Not a Talon bloom, not one known to their records. Something else, a flower that bled ash when the sun touched it. On Syrinx Magnus, in the endless neon trenches of Hive War 18, the Mordian Iron Guard were fighting cultist waves that did not sleep, did not speak, did not stop. Sergeant Albrecht Dien, a man who had not blinked without permission in 27 years, found one of his own men painting on the bunker walls. Not graffiti, murals, scenes of soldiers planting seeds in helmets, of commissars weeping openly into the dirt, of trenches where children played in silence. Dien executed the soldier, of course, but when the blood dried, he found his own hands sketching the same lines. He tried to report the anomaly. The Vox sputtered and said only, "The soil remembers." Even the Catechins, jungle-born brutes who trusted only their instincts and their knives, were not immune. Corporal Maya Vren, daughter of 3 generations of snake-bitten survivalists, found her units circling a grave they didn't dig. A fresh one, shallow, careful, marked by a bayonet stuck upright in the center. On the bayonet's blade, etched not in blood, but with care, were 6 words. Not forgotten. Krieg walks in silence. No one admitted digging it. No one could explain the wildflowers growing around it. But none stepped closer, and none stepped on it. not even the jungle beasts. On Cadia's broken moons, the few surviving regiments holding out on debris clusters had begun to hear things. Not words, not orders, lullabies, faint, low, childlike. Captain Joris Keld, former PDF, now de facto Planetary Command, claimed it was stress, warp residue, trauma. But when he reviewed helmet cam footage from a recon patrol, he paused. The entire unit had paused mid-march and dropped to one knee, not because of ambush, but in reverence. All 5 Cadian survivors later reported no memory of stopping. Each of them had drawn a symbol on their flak armor, in ash. It was a spade, not the card, the tool, the one used to dig. Back on Krieg 9, within the Breach Song and Soil Sacrament, the Death Korps knew something was changing, not just in themselves, but in the galaxy around them. Colonel Vahlen received no official transmissions, for the Adeptus Administratum had blacklisted the entire region. But messages still arrived, carried on winds, on dreams, on the wings of carrion birds that should not have flown in the void. Each bore fragments of painted cloth, shreds of regimental banners altered with new script, phrases written in the Emperor's tongue, but not his voice of war, his voice of mourning. We remember, Krieg leads the path, not one soul forgotten, not one death wasted. Dig not graves, but gardens. There was debate now within the 1453rd, not open, never open, but in eyes, in pauses, in the space between a nod and an order obeyed. Some believed they were being tested, that this miracle was a trap of chaos, a subtle heresy of comfort. They sharpened their bayonets harder than ever, prayed in silence thrice daily, refused to speak to the child. Others had begun to change, not in uniform, not in posture, but in stillness. They no longer dug graves mechanically. They dug with intention. They no longer feared death, but questioned the reason for life's dismissal. They began carving names into their shovels, not of saints, not of primarchs, but of friends. The echo child, the bleeding oracle of ink and memory, had grown quiet, not distant, but calm. She no longer wept while writing. She smiled as she bled the names, and when asked why, she simply said, "Because they're listening now." One day she gave Colonel Vahlen a seed, small, round, pale as moonlight. It hummed when he held it. When he asked what it was, she answered, "The first flower that never got planted, from the first soldier who died before he could return home." And she asked him to plant it, not in soil, but in stone. So he did. They found a ruined basilica on the edge of the breach, once a chapel to the Emperor's wrath, now empty. He placed the seed in the crack between 2 ancient tiles. The stone split, the flower grew. It had no petals, only thorns shaped like embracing arms. It pulsed, and from its thorns grew tiny steel tags, dog tags, regimental numbers etched in them from wars lost before mankind even counted centuries. Other regiments began to converge, not in fleets, not in sanctioned transport, but in dreams. Pilots diverted mid-jump, psychers convulsed and set new courses. A Black Templar ship was reported lost in the warp, only to re-emerge near Krieg 9, its captain claiming, "The Emperor himself walked our decks and wept." The Imperium did not issue commands, it issued warnings. Any regiment that approached Krieg was to be censured, their names redacted, their honours stripped, their survival disavowed, but still they came, by instinct, by hope. by a song they did not know they remembered. And Krieg waited, not with guns, not with fear, but with open hands. Hands calloused by war, soaked in blood, but now ready to build. No war is ever silent forever, not even the ones fought without guns. In the clay-lined veins of Krieg 9, within trenches where no sun ever reached, a new war had begun. It made no sound, it made no smoke, but it scarred deeper than any shell crater. For the first time since the founding of the Death Korps, brother looked to brother, not in unity, but in division. Not over tactics, not over honor, but over what it meant to die. Some said the soil was singing, others said it was whispering betrayal. Lieutenant Durand, a veteran of 112 campaigns, stood before a shrine of shattered Aquilas and refused to kneel. "This is not the Emperor's will," he muttered. "This softness, this heresy dressed in flowers." He crushed a thorn vine beneath his boot, one of the strange creeping plants that now bloomed from the trenches themselves, always growing where the child had wept. "This is not our Krieg. This is a lie, a poison, a dream dreamt by cowards." Others disagreed. Commissar Erin Vale, once known for executing a platoon of deserters without blinking, now walked with bare hands. No bolt pistol, no power sword, only a notebook filled with names. Names of the dead, names of the forgotten, names of the ones they'd once been ordered to leave unburied. "If you cannot remember the name of the man who died for you," she said, voice soft but steady, "then you are not a soldier. You are a tool." Her words spread like fever through the ranks. Not all agreed, but too many listened. A rift formed, not in open revolt, not yet, but in drills that no longer synchronized. In prayers spoken with subtle differences. Some still recited, "We are the silence in the dark. We are the last breath before the grave." But others now whispered a newer litany. "We are the roots beneath the stone. We are the memory that grows." The rations still came. The lasguns still fired. But the soul of Krieg had split. Colonel Varlin watched it unfold from the observation trench. He said nothing. He wrote nothing. But he stood each night before the blooming spade flower embedded in the stone chapel and asked only one thing: what will remain? He did not pray for victory. He prayed for meaning. The Echo Child had grown weaker. Her writing slowed. Her blood no longer inked prophecy. It fell in lines, as if tracing boundaries between the living and the dead. She began naming things not yet dead. Commissars, officers, chaplains, as if preparing them. Varlin feared what it meant. When he asked her why the change had come, she replied, "Because one side will not yield, and the soil does not forgive those who forget." The schism turned violent on the 44th cycle. It began with a bayonet, silent, swift, a death by hand, not by order. Private Hall, a quiet trench digger, was found slumped against a wall of prayer scrolls. The word traitor had been carved into his chest, but so had the word gardener. He had planted flowers in his mess tin. That was his only crime. Commissar Vale demanded investigation. Lieutenant Joran refused. "We do not investigate sentiment," he spat. "We cut it out." And then, for the first time in recorded Krieg history, a commissar and an officer drew arms on one another, not for cowardice, but over mercy. Varlin stood between them. He raised no weapon. He spoke no threat. He simply held out a rusted spade, the same one used to bury the first seed. "If we must draw blood, let it be on ground that remembers it," he said. Neither fired, but nothing healed. That night, the breach howled louder than ever. The warp wind stirred, and for the first time since the trenches were dug, the enemy spoke, a chorus, multi-voiced, mocking, knowing. You plant flowers, little worms. Let us show you what blooms in despair. And from the rift emerged the garden of woe, a demon engine hybrid, shaped like a massive skeletal tree, its branches twisted with screaming faces, its roots tearing up the trench lines as it marched. It was not a charge. It was a pilgrimage, as if the enemy had waited for this division. The Death Korps rallied, all of them. Even those who had once argued over petals now stood shoulder to shoulder beneath shells of weeping iron. They did not speak of doctrine. They did not pray for death. They fought to remember. For once, for the first time, they fought for each other, not just for orders. The garden shrieked. It impaled 6 men in a single breath. Thorns the size of tank shells drove into foxholes. One entire company was swallowed by a blooming pod that digested them over the course of an hour, their screams echoing like rainfall. But the core held. They laid mines beneath its roots. They sang no hymns, but they dug as they fought. Each fallen soldier was buried by the one next to him, even as the shells fell, even as blood watered the trench. The Echo Child stood atop the chapel stone. She bled freely now, not in agony, but in release. From her fingers fell not ink, but seeds. They drifted on the wind, landing on shoulders, helmets, and shattered earth. Wherever they touched, a whisper rose. We remember. We remember. We remember. The demon tree paused. Its limbs trembled. And then, for the first time, it withered. Not by fire, not by bolter, but by memory. In the aftermath, as corpses were counted and names were carved into trench stone, Varlan gathered all surviving officers. He spoke quietly. No rhetoric, no creed, just this. Let the Imperium call us heretics. Let them forget our names. But let no soldier under my command be buried without being known. Let no death pass unnoticed. Let no man go to his grave as a number. The schism did not vanish, but the rage softened, and in its place came roots. Thus ended the first war not against chaos, but against the forgetting of one's soul. In a galaxy that fed on names without faces, Krieg had begun to carve identity into its bones, not for pride, not for rebellion, but because even the dead deserved to be known. A signal pulsed from Krieg 9, encrypted, coded, classified as a red-level anomaly, a record of events, demonic manifestation, sanctioned psycho exposure, commissariat deviation, unauthorized ritual seedings. It reached Terra in 14 hours. It reached the Inquisition in less than 2. And then it reached her. Inquisitor Elindra Morth sat beneath the golden eye of the Ordo Hereticus, poring over dossiers sealed with wax, ash, and blood. Her record was long. She had unmade entire sectors for lesser crimes. She had turned entire guard regiments to dust for preaching the wrong benediction. And now she held a page marked with a single line. Memory as weapon. Identity as sacrament. Soil as sanctum. She read it twice, then 3 times. Then she whispered, Krieg remembers. And for the first time in decades, Elindra Morth wept. She did not weep for pity. She wept for what it meant. Krieg, the Imperium's perfect blade, was chipping at the hilt. She could not allow it. But she also could not destroy it. Not yet. Not while it still bled for the Emperor. "I will go alone," she told the High Conclave. "They will not see a threat. They will see a whisper." Permission was granted, and so she descended. When her black Corvette broke atmosphere, Krieg 9 greeted her not with sirens or salutes, but silence. No parades, no banners, only trenches. And within them, men still digging. Digging even when there were no dead to bury. She was met not by a colonel nor a commissar, but by a child. The Echo Child, now pale as chalk, stood barefoot in the mud, her fingers wrapped in bandages of scripture. Her eyes were wide, not afraid, not awed, only knowing. "I dreamed of you," the child said. "You are the one who brings fire." Elindra knelt. "Do you fear fire?" The child shook her head. "Number, but the roots do." They walked together, unguarded, through trenches where hymnals had been replaced by names. Names carved into walls, into crates, into helmets placed atop shallow graves. Names written in dried ink, oil, and sometimes blood. Each one spoken aloud before burial. It was heresy, and it was beautiful. At the chapel, she found Colonel Vahlen waiting. He did not salute. He did not kneel. He only gestured to the spade flower blooming in the stone. "You came to judge," he said. "Then judge. But do not pretend you don't understand." Elindra looked at the flower. It had bloomed in the shape of a skull. "You name your dead," she replied. "But what of duty? What of anonymity? What of the doctrine that kept your world from extinction?" "We still die without question," Vahlen said. "But we no longer die without meaning." She tested him. She summoned psychers in secret. She invoked ritual purity trials. She watched entire platoons endure flames, silence, and fasting. And never once did they recite anything but the Emperor's name. But always, after the trials, they returned to the trench-side graves, whispering names with muddy reverence. She inspected Commissar Vale's logs. Not a single soldier executed for cowardice in 12 cycles, but casualties had increased, not from desertion, but from voluntary sacrifice. Men threw themselves onto mines not to win ground, but to shield comrades. A kind of bravery too human for Krieg, too dangerous. Elindra confronted the Echo Child. "You planted the seed of heresy," she said. "You turned soldiers into mourners." The child only smiled. "I didn't plant it. The soil did. I only reminded them they were men, not shadows." The Inquisitor raised her hand, preparing the rite of silencing, the punishment for psychic corruption. But then, the child spoke one final word. "Cadia." It struck like a bolt round. Elindra froze. "What did you say?" "I saw it in the warp, the green eye, the broken world, the ones who died, all of them, unburied in space. I wept for them, and the soil wept with me." That night, Elindra did not sleep. She wandered through the trenches, through the underground bunkers, through the vast catacombs of unmarked dead from wars past, and she listened, not to speeches, not to sermons, but to silence filled with remembering. She made her decision at dawn. A message was sent back to Terra. Krieg remains loyal, cultural deviations observed, no demonic persistence, no excommunication necessary. Then she burned the report. To Colonel Vahlen, she offered no threat, only a single sentence. "Do not forget the Emperor in your remembering." And to the Echo Child, she gave a gift, a data slate. Within it, the entire litany of Cadia's fallen regiments. They too should be remembered, Elindra said. The child held the slate to her chest and wept. Thank you for naming them. As the corvette rose through the ash-thick sky, Elindra Morth felt something strange in her soul. It was not guilt, it was not pride, it was hope. Hope that perhaps Krieg, in its broken, muddy grief, had remembered something the Imperium had long buried, that the dead are only lost when they are forgotten. And somewhere beneath the soil, the roots grew deeper, not in rebellion, not in corruption, but in the quiet defiance of memory. The first flower bloomed in silence. The second came with a scream. It was in the southern trench line, Krieg 9 Sector Delta. The fighting had long ceased. The orcs were gone. But one soldier, Trooper Hall, began to dream, and when he awoke, there was mud in his lungs, not choking, not suffocating, welcoming. The medici said he was stable, but he didn't speak, not for 3 days. And then, while digging a trench for no war, no enemy, no reason, he sang, "Soil of fathers, ash of sons. Beneath this trench, we bloom as one." The men beside him wept, not because the song was beautiful, but because they remembered it, even though no one had ever heard it before. Second bloom spread faster than the first. No banners, no rituals, no defiance, only dreams, shared, identical, whispered between gas mask filters and broken Vox units. "I dreamed of the garden," said one, "where no name is lost and no death is wasted." "I saw a trench that circled the stars," said another, "and it was full of blooming bones. I saw the commissar laying down his pistol and planting a name." Some dreams were just nonsense, others were doctrine. At first, the commissars grew suspicious. Vale questioned them. He even executed one. But the next morning, the body had vanished. In its place, a single flower growing from the helmet left behind. Its petals formed a skull. Again. Colonel Valen convened his inner circle. "This is no mere contagion," he said. "It is an evolution, an inheritance, and it is loyal, but it is also changing." They did not argue. They knew it was true. Krieg had always grown things in the dark, but this was different. This was life remembering death. Reports from the field showed no breakdown of discipline. On the contrary, performance improved. Squads fought harder, with more coordination. They retrieved wounded at twice the rate. They buried every fallen comrade, even under fire. But they also began to chant names before going over the top. Not orders, not code numbers, names. And before detonating charges, engineers carved initials into their explosive satchels. One wrote, "For Yorick, who never saw the sun." The Minitorum received the after-action reports with confusion. Krieg regiments showing 127% projected output. Psyker exposure, none. Moral deviation, negligible. But beneath the figures, something was rising. Something unmeasured. A kind of purpose not issued from high command. A will to remember. In the depths of the burial tunnels, the Echo Child painted, with mud, with ash, with water drawn from the breath of the dying. She painted the Garden of Woe, not as horror, but as haven. In it, the Emperor stood not upon a throne, but upon the mud, barefoot, with open hands, and around him millions knelt, faces scarred and bloodied, but smiling. Colonel Valen entered the chamber in silence. "You see things no Vox can record," he said. The child nodded. "Because I am nothing, and the soil speaks best to the forgotten. And what does it say now? She turned her head slowly. Her eyes, now stained permanently dark from warp dreaming, blinked once. It says the war will never end, but how we carry the dead, that can change. Elsewhere, a young guardsman lay dying, his legs crushed beneath a collapsed pillbox. No Medicaid could reach him in time. He did not scream. Instead, he reached into the mud and pulled something out. A small wooden tag, a name, not his. Stein, born in Ash, died for breath, carried the wounded before carrying himself. He whispered it and died, smiling. When his squad mates found him, they buried him in silence. Then they planted the tag beside his helmet, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. Commissar Vale returned to the cathedral trench. The flower still bloomed. By now, there were dozens, each one shaped differently. One had petals like glass barrels. Another bloomed in the colour of old parchment. One had blood on the tips, and it never dried. He stared for a long time. Then he did the unthinkable. He removed his cap and saluted. In orbit, no one noticed anything wrong. Supply chains continued, orders fulfilled, regiments reassigned with no complaint. But Krieg's transmissions grew strange. They began to end every report with a phrase not in standard lexicon. All names shall be sown, all routes shall be known. At first, it was dismissed as a regional sign-off. But some inquisitors remembered. Elindra Morth remembered. And in silence, she smiled. For Krieg was not changing into something broken. It was changing into something whole. Still loyal, still obedient, but no longer empty. The bloom was not heresy. It was healing. Beneath the endless war fronts, beneath the broken spires and radiation glass, the roots grew deeper. They wound through the bones of forgotten soldiers. They whispered their names into the earth. And the soil, once silent, began to sing, a lullaby in mud and memory. It was not peace. It was not the end of war, but it was a beginning, a second bloom, and it would not be the last. There was no ink. There was no parchment. There were no scribes. And yet, a book began to take shape. Beneath the broken ribs of a Leviathan transport, half buried in shale and blood, the first verse was etched into steel with a combat knife. He who digs remembers, he who buries blesses, and he who names never dies. No one claimed to have written it, but every man in the 145th Krieg Siege Regiment memorized it. By nightfall, it had spread to 3 other companies. By the next week, it had spread across regiments. No orders, no heralds, just dirt-scrawled verses traded in silence. The Trench Psalm Codex had begun. The commissars called it a security threat. The chaplains called it poetic dogma. But the soldiers called it what it was, truth whispered from the soil. The Codex was not a rebellion. It never questioned duty, never challenged command. It offered no excuses for cowardice, only words for the silence between orders, only prayers for the moments between deaths. Verse 12 scratched into the inside of a bayonet sheath. We were born beneath the surface, but we are not roots. We are the blade, and the mud is our memory. Verse 44 found carved into a lasback. Leave no wound unnamed, for pain is how the dead speak. Verse 70 discovered in a ration tin, passed between trenches. The Emperor does not forget, and neither must we. At first, the codex was scattered, fragments passed like contraband. Then the Echo Child began to collect them. No one told her to. She simply appeared where verses were born and transcribed them in her own way, not with ink or code, but with drawings in ash. She would press her hands to trench walls and paint with her palms, each verse accompanied by a symbol, a broken helmet, a bloom growing from a skull, the silhouette of a soldier kneeling, not in defeat, but in reverence. Commissar Vale found one such symbol outside his command dugout, a painted eye, closed, with roots growing from its lashes. Beneath it, the words, "We no longer fear blindness, for the soil sees in dreams." He ordered it removed. It reappeared the next night, drawn deeper, carved this time. Vale did not order it removed again. High Command on Krieg Primus began to notice, not because the Codex was openly spoken of, but because patterns emerged in reports. Squad survival rates had increased 18% across sectors with high Codex circulation. Post-combat psychological fracture had dropped. Mortality self-sacrifice rates rose, not from desperation, but from what Medici called spiritual clarity. Troopers, before detonation, would quote Codex passages with the serenity of priests. "I bury myself so others need not," whispered a soldier before sealing a bunker breach with his own charge. The ecclesiarchy investigated. They expected heresy. What they found was something far more dangerous. Faith not issued from terror, but not corrupted, not tainted, not demonic, only new. A faith that believed every fallen guardsman was a seed, a faith where every trench was sacred ground. The most feared verse was found stitched into a bandage on a dying officer. "You do not end in silence, you are planted, and from your ribs the next breath shall bloom." The officer died smiling. The bandage was passed from one regiment to another, never cleaned, never replaced. It became known as the Shroud of Ash. Touching it before battle became a quiet ritual. Even Commissar Vale eventually touched it. Only once. He didn't speak of it. But after that day, he began recording Codex verses himself. In the catacombs beneath Krieg 6 Station, a shelter long abandoned by the Adeptus Mechanicus was reopened, not for weapon storage, not for logistics, but for compilation. 12 Krieg scribes, all volunteers, gathered there. None spoke. They were permitted no names. Each day they scratched Codex verses into spent shell casings, lining the chamber wall by wall. Each casing placed with care, tip pointing upward, toward terror, toward the Emperor. The Codex was not kept in a book. It was kept in the trenches themselves. Each blast wall inscribed, each bunk, each rusted spade, each helmet that outlived its owner. Even the artillery began to carry verses, painted in white across barrels that screamed across worlds. Dig, fire, bury, remember. A new creed, but one no less loyal. When questioned by Inquisitor Morth, Commissar Vale said the following: "We remain tools of the Emperor, but we no longer see ourselves as tools alone. A tool is discarded, a memory is carried. Is that defiance, Commissar?" "No," he replied. "It is devotion, and devotion that remembers is more dangerous than fear." In time, the Codex reached other worlds, not through transmission, through soil. Krieg regiments redeployed to distant fronts began burying their dead with Codex verses carved into bones, and wherever they fell, flowers bloomed. Not always real, sometimes only hallucinated, sometimes only in dreams, but they bloomed, and always the same verse would follow: "We do not rot, we become root, and through us the Emperor marches again." So the Trench Psalm Codex grew, not by hand, not by will, but by inheritance, by blood bone and the soft voice of soil. The soil remembers what high command forgets. The soil sings what no voice dares to transmit. And in the dark, between shellfire and silence, the Death Korps of Krieg, once nameless, once empty, have begun to write themselves into eternity. One verse at a time. It is said that those who dream on Krieg are mad. For Krieg does not forgive sleep. Krieg remembers. And it was into such sleep that Commissar Vale descended. He had not meant to dream. The stems had failed. The trench dust clung to his lungs, and his thoughts fractured like frozen glass. When his eyes closed, the blackness did not greet him with silence. It greeted him with shovels. He stood waist-deep in ash. The sky above was an oil painting smeared with fire. There were no stars, only smoke. And above the smoke a voice spoke in shuddering syllables of breathless despair. Tell me, Vale, what grows from salt and ruin? He turned. Behind him stood a boy. Not the Echo Child, not a psyker. A boy in a tattered Krieg cadet uniform, no older than 13. Half his face was a skull, not from wound or decay, but because he had been born that way. And in his arms, he carried a cracked las rifle like it was a candle. Vale reached for his bolt pistol, but it was gone. Only the shovel at his belt remained. The boy looked up and whispered, "You already know how this ends." He pointed to the horizon, a trench line, endless, jagged, burning. Above it, giant silhouettes marched, not Astartes, not demons, but Krieg troopers the size of titans, made of earth and bone and wire. They did not speak, they simply dug. And every shovelful they cast into the air landed in Vale's chest. He fell to his knees. The ash thickened. The trench walls narrowed. And from the ground around him, helmets emerged. Old issue, pre-purge, the condemned. The original sinners of Krieg. One by one they rose, not to accuse, not to curse, but to kneel before him, in reverence, in silence, in shared guilt. The boy knelt last. "You carry the verses, Vale, but you've forgotten the first." Vale choked. "I know no scripture." "Yes," the boy said, "but you remember names." Suddenly, a dozen names rang out in the dust, shouted by 100 throats. They were Vale's squadmates, from his first trench, men who had died under his command. Their names echoed, each one a hammer blow against his chestplate, each one etched into his ribs. "You thought forgetting was mercy," said the boy, his eyes wide, wet, with ash, "but memory is mercy." And the boy held out his cracked las rifle. Its barrel bloomed, not a flower, but a mouth. It whispered the first verse of the Codex, not as poetry, but as command. "Remember, or we rise without meaning, bury, or we grow without roots." Vale reached for the rifle. When his fingers touched it, he saw the moment Krieg burned. The moment its high command unleashed the atomic purge that made it holy in the Imperium's eyes. He saw the cities vanish. He saw the soil scream. He saw the first soldier pick up a shovel, not to attack, but to atone. That man's face? His father's. Vale screamed and woke. His dugout was silent. The candle had burned to its base. His uniform was soaked in sweat. Ash clung to his palms, not metaphorical, but real, as if pulled from the dream. He rose. He walked out into the trench line without his cap, without his pistol. He passed his guards. They did not salute. They watched, for they had heard him scream, and none dared ask why. At dawn, Vale stood before a wall of mortar-shattered steel. It had once marked the edge of the forward position. Now, he scraped it clean with his gloved hands. and using the tip of his trench blade, he etched something new. He who forgets the names will never know the silence. Below it, he placed the helmet of his first friend lost, Private Khan, dead 12 years, never once spoken aloud, now enshrined. The codex had many verses now, but this was the first signed by a commissar, word spread by bootfall and whisper. Vale had dreamt, and he had remembered, and in Krieg, dreams that remember carry more power than edicts from terror. A week later, a trench chapel was dug, not a temple, not a shrine, just a hollow of earth with a list of names. Names, nothing more. Some were scratched in blood, some painted in gun oil, others marked by bone shards. A silent ritual began. Before each battle, Krieg troopers would kneel, not to pray for survival, but to whisper one name, any name, even if it wasn't their own, even if it had already been forgotten by all but the soil. And when Commissar Vale was later asked, during a high command review, why he permitted such unsanctioned devotion, he answered only this: better to march beside names than beside silence. The Codex is not heresy. It is a garden growing in the Emperor's shadow. They did not understand, but they did not question further, for Vale had not just survived his command, he had become something rare, a rememberer. In the end, every Kriegman is just soil waiting to be used. But soil is not nothing. Soil is the memory of fire. And fire, when remembered properly, becomes light, even underground. Thus, through the eyes of dreams and the voice of the dead, Commissar Vale was no longer merely an enforcer. He was now a scribe, a shepherd of verses, and the Codex had written a new chapter through him. And so the war continued. Krieg bled, Krieg buried, Krieg endured. The Codex spread, not through orders, not through Vox commands, but by whispers in the trenches. It was never written in full. It could not be. It was carried in the dirt under fingernails, in names scratched into tin plates, in verses breathed between bayonet thrusts. Each Kriegmann knew only a part of it, and that was enough. The final war fought by the 223rd Siege Battalion would be in a place no maps marked, a world unfit for settlement, toxic, frozen, haunted by warp storms and the bones of forgotten tyrants. Its name was never spoken. To the Krieg, it was simply the final position, a last stand, not against heretics, not against Xenos, but against time. There were no reinforcements coming, no hope of extraction. The 223rd had been deemed expended. High Command had given the silent order: hold, delay, die, and so they dug. Commissar Vale was old now. His once black coat faded grey with chemical wind and trench ash. He no longer carried a pistol, only a shovel, and a book, bound in flak armour, inked in soot. Its pages were blank, but when he opened it and held it over the trench fires at dusk, names emerged in flickering ember script. Each name, a soldier. Each name, a verse. Each verse, a grave. When the first wave hit, mutant warbands swarming in packs of gnashing, rust-worshipping hunger, the Krieg did not flinch. They stood in the trench line shoulder to shoulder, as they always had. Silent, no war cry, no plea, only the quiet hum of faith and the recitation of the Codex. We were not born, we were buried, and we rose. We are not men. We are the memory of obedience. We are the answer to a question no one dared ask. We are Krieg. The mutants died in waves. Then came the tanks. Then came the demons. None passed the line. Not because the Krieg were stronger, but because they had already died. They simply refused to fall again. Vale stood at the center trench, wounded, blind in one eye, his ribcage cracked, but he still whispered the names, and those who heard them fought harder. Even the dying rose again for one last volley. In his final breath, Vale placed the shovel into the earth. He was not the first to do so, nor the last, but in doing so, he completed the last verse of the Codex. And it was not a command. It was not a prayer. It was simply enough. When the silence returned to the battlefield, after the warp storms fled, after the dead finished their duties, the world was nothing but a graveyard. But in its center, untouched by decay, stood a shovel, upright, and beside it, the book, still open, still burning faintly with names. No wind turned the pages, only the slow settling of ash. Years later, an explorator team from the Adeptus Mechanicus discovered the site. They found no living souls, only trenches, and in the trenches, verses, etched into stone, sung into vox loops, tattooed into skulls. The tech priests did not understand them, but they did not destroy them. They archived every word and sent the data to Terra. It never reached the Golden Throne, but it found its way elsewhere, into hearts, into hidden places of memory, into regiments who had never knelt before, and soon, across Forge worlds, hive cities, and death zones, others began to whisper the Codex Krieg, not to become Krieg, but to remember what it meant to stand, to bury the past, to rise from it, to carry names when no one else would. And deep beneath Krieg itself, in the black libraries where no torch dares burn, the Codex was given its final title, the Book of the Unseen. It had no author, no sigil, no seal, only a final inscription written in dust. We did not seek victory, we sought silence, and in silence we found purpose. Thus ends the unseen war, not with a scream, not with a statue, but with a shovel in the dirt, and the memory of those who carried it.